Hi, this is Dr. Gregory Sadler. I'm a professor of philosophy and the president and founder of an educational consulting company called Reason.io, where we put philosophy into practice. I've studied and taught philosophy for over 20 years, and I find that many people run into difficulties reading classic philosophical texts. Sometimes it's the way things are said or how the text is structured. But the concepts themselves are not always that complicated, and that's where I come in. To help students and lifelong learners, I've been producing longer lecture videos and posting them to YouTube. Many viewers say they find them useful. What you're currently watching is part of a new series of shorter videos, each of them focused on one core concept from an important philosophical text. I hope you find it useful as well. At the midway point of part 3 of his work, Ressentiment, Max Scheler is going to have a rather sustained discussion of what he's terming altruism and its connection with this dynamic that he's identified as ressentiment. And his goal here is to suggest that any genuine Christian attitude of love is not going to map onto, and in fact, it's going to be opposed to this modern notion and buzzword of altruism that is typically going to be opposed to its opposite, egoism. Neither of these is going to be a very good way to characterize Christian love, according to Scheler, although there will be plenty of Christians who mask what's going on with them, claiming that they're embodying Christian love when they're really not. And it looks very similar to what he's calling altruism here. So we begin by him talking about there being a completely different way of stooping to the small, the lowly, and the common, even though it may seem almost the same as the one who is doing it out of vitality, out of love. He says, here, love does not spring from an abundance of vital power, from firmness and security. And so this is where we're going to get to what he's calling a modern substitute for love, which he's going to term altruism. Now, I do have to say this. Not everybody uses the word altruism or altruistic in exactly the same way. So if you're hearing this and you're kind of blanching, you're like, oh, I don't like this from Scheler because he's saying something bad about a word or a concept that I really like, you need to think about whether what you call altruism actually maps onto what he's calling altruism. So let's see what it actually does look like. He says, okay, it doesn't spring from an abundance of vital power, from firmness and security. It's a euphemism for escape, for an inability to remain at home with oneself. And here he uses the French term chez soi, which means like in your own place, right? Turning towards others is but the secondary consequence of this urge to flee from oneself. And then he makes a remark. One cannot love anybody without turning away from oneself. So loving is, not going to be just all focused on oneself, of course, right? Because then it's not really love. It's you just sort of, using the other person as a prop. But there are different motives, you could say, for turning away from oneself. He says, the crucial question is whether this movement is prompted by the desire to turn towards a positive value. Do I see somebody in need, somebody in a lower status or station, and yet I recognize the humanity within them and I love them through my action? Or is it a different motive, he says? Is it the intention of radical escape from oneself? Now, I want to pause here for a moment because one thing that Scheler could have brought up at this point, but doesn't, which is very interesting because it is developed within the early Christian thought, mostly developed in monastic communities, having to do with the 8 capital vices, which later we see transformed in Western Christianity into the 7 deadly sins. Now, the 8 capital vices are ideas that are coming from these monastic communities, particularly those in Egypt. We get them through John Cassian, who is drawing on Evagrius Ponticus as well. And among them, there is something that we often just don't translate. It's called acedia, right? And it means a sort of restlessness, an inability, as Scheler just said here, to remain at home with oneself. The monk who doesn't stick to his work or his prayers or his reading and says, I should go visit Father John or Brother Simone and see what's going on with them. Maybe they need some help, right? And they're not paying attention to their own stuff. They're going off, they're distracting themselves, right? This is sometimes called the noonday devil. That is very similar to what Scheler is talking about here. So he says that we can identify a really key characteristic in this, love of the second variety, and he puts love in quotes, because it's not real love, is inspired by an opposite to love. Self-hatred. Hatred of what? One's own weakness and misery. The mind is always on the point of departing for distant places, afraid of seeing itself and its inferiority. It is driven to give itself to the other, not because of the worth of the other, the value of the other, but merely for the sake of his otherness. And in a way, when you read that, you're thinking two things. One is, the more abstract the other person is, the better it is. Then they can just be completely other, right? The other as a sort of category. And you might think about all that was made of that in continental philosophy after the time of Scheler by certain thinkers, right? The other thing that I think that we can draw out of this is any sort of real particularity of the other person. Does it fit under this category of otherness? Perhaps not. So it might not be a genuine acceptance and love for the other person. Now he goes on and he says, modern philosophical jargon has found a revealing term for this phenomenon. This is altruism. And he says, this love is not directed at any previously discovered positive value, nor does any such value flash up in the act of loving. What is going on there? Nothing but the urge to turn away from oneself and to lose oneself in other people's business. Again, something similar to that vice of acedia. Then he gives us some examples of this. He says, we all know a certain type of man frequently found among socialists, suffragettes, and all people with an ever-ready social conscience, a kind of person whose social activity is clearly prompted by inability to keep his attention focused on himself, on his own tasks and problems. Looking away from oneself is here mistaken for love. Now, we might read this and be like, aha, so it's the progressives that do this. Well, I think if we're actually reading this closely, we can see that a lot of people who bill themselves as being conservatives or traditional or things like that, including many contemporary Christians, are also equally given to this sort of busybodiness, this inquiry, not paying attention to themselves because they don't actually love themselves, paying attention to what everybody else is doing and helping them out. But do they really love the other who they're helping? I think the answer here, Scheler is saying, is no. Because he goes on and he says, isn't it abundantly clear that altruism, the interest in others and their lives, has nothing to do with love? Why? Well, because it's not really motivated by love for the person. You are perhaps helping them in certain ways, although you don't want to help, as he points out, you don't want to help them too much because then they're no longer lowly and, weak and vulnerable. So you may want to keep them in a kind of dependency. So altruism, nothing to do with love for the other, at least the way that Scheler is understanding the term altruism. And then we might say, okay, so maybe he's an egoist then, right? He's advocating for some sort of rational egoism or love-based egoism or something like that. And Scheler says, well, no. Why not? He says that conversely, there's a form of genuine self-love which has nothing to do at all with egoism. It is precisely the essential feature of egoism that it does not apprehend the full value of the isolated self. So it's a way in which the self doesn't apprehend its own value. The egoist sees himself only with regard to the others as a member of a society who wishes to possess and acquire more than the others. So we could say that his understanding of egoism here might be different than other ways in which people use that term. But one of the things this points to, which goes beyond Scheler, is that a lot of important moral theories, whether they're that of Christian love or going back into antiquity, we could think of Aristotle, the Stoics, it doesn't fit neatly into this paradigm that so many modern thinkers love to use, being used there ironically, they enjoy using, they can't think outside of, where you have egoism on one side and you have altruism on the other side, and they're opposites to each other, and everybody fits in there somehow, right? That doesn't work for genuine ethics. And that shows you something wrong with these conceptions of altruism and egoism. So he says that self-directedness or other-directedness for the egoist have no essential bearing on the specific quality of love or hatred, right? So coming back to altruism, he's going to tell us that the altruistic urge is really a form of hatred, self-hatred, and here's where it becomes distinctive, posing as its opposite, posing as the opposite of hatred, namely love, but it doesn't pose as the opposite of self-hatred. It ignores or hides its own self-hatred and pretends to be love for the other. But it really still does involve some kind of hatred. So what is it? He says it disguises itself. So if we look at ressentiment morality, love for the small, the poor, the weak, the oppressed, is really a type of hatred and envy, disguised hatred, repressed envy, an impulse to detract. So key characteristics of ressentiment. And where is it directed? Is it directed against those little people? No. It's to their benefit in a certain way. Why? Because it's actually being directed against the opposite, wealth, strength, power, largesse. So Scheler says Nietzsche got this right. When hatred does not dare to come out in the open, it can be easily expressed in the form of ostensible love, love for something which has features that are the opposite of the hated object. So what's really going on is I hate myself. I hate those who seem to occupy a better position, strength, wealth, largesse, honor, pick whatever it is that we want. So I've got hatred towards myself, hatred towards that other. And then I say, but this other over here who's weak, who's, poor, who's small, who's vulnerable, I will love them. Not like those bastards over there. And this could be coming straight out of Nietzsche's genealogy, essay 1 and essay 3, we don't like those birds of prey. We love the little lambs. So, you see, this is where where Scheler thinks that Nietzsche has some things right. He just doesn't think that this is reflective of genuine Christian morality, although there are many Christians who, in fact, do behave this way. And he talks about the tone of a certain socially minded type of priest, and a pious, unctuous tone, sermonizing that love for the small is our first duty, love for the humble in spirit, since God gives grace to them. And what does he say about these sorts of people? They're not real Christians. This is actually hatred posing as Christian love. He says, we clearly feel how the sight of these phenomenon fills the mind with secret satisfaction and how they themselves are loved, not the higher values which lie behind them. So, he goes on and he says, nor can the helping deed be the important thing in this perspective, because that would make the small less agreeable to God and be an expression of hatred. You don't want to make the small big, because then they're not, the object of your love, your fake love, right? So what we've got here is love for something with features opposite of the hated object. And he's going to say something really interesting here, which pertains to Christianity and not to secular forms of altruism. So he says that when we're told that these people will be rewarded in heaven for their distress, and that heaven is the exact reverse of the earthly order, and he uses the example of the first shall be last, we distinctly feel how the ressentiment-laden man transfers to God the vengeance he cannot himself wreak on the great, and he can satisfy this revenge, at least in imagination, with the aid, there's a beautiful line here, of an otherworldly mechanism of rewards and punishments. So he says the core of the ressentiment Christian's idea of God is still the avenging Jehovah. It is not a gospel-oriented message, not the genuine gospel. It is about, it's sort of like the book of Revelations, right? Which, interestingly, there was a lot of debate in the early church about, is this actually canonical? That is a book just laden with ressentiment. It would have almost been better had it been left out, given what a obstacle it has proved for so many Christians who fall into this sort of mentality. So he says the core of the ressentiment Christian's idea of God is the avenging Jehovah, but the difference is that revenge is now masked as sham love, fake love for the small. And there's a big consequence to this. There's no longer any organic and experienced bond between the kingdom of God and the visible realm, so that the values and laws of retaliation of the former kingdom of God have ceased to be simply a purer and more perfect expression of those which already appear in life. So in a way, you don't have a genuine kingdom of God. You have a facsimile of it that is oriented by reversal, revenge, and ressentiment. So he says, the kingdom of God has become the other world which stands mechanically besides this world, and this, he says, is an opposition unknown to the strongest periods of Christianity. It is merely a plane of being where the shadows of the people and events we experience carry on a dance led by ressentiment according to a rhythm which is simply opposite to that of the earth. Again, this is where he is appropriating Nietzsche's ideas that Christianity is essentially, driven by ressentiment. Scheler saying genuine Christianity isn't, but it's certainly possible, and it has been the case, that what some people call Christianity can just be filled with ressentiment. And so we've actually come a little ways from modern altruism in talking about that. But you see how for Scheler, these motifs of altruism understood as escape, as self-hatred, and the kingdom of God understood as merely reversal of the status quo, rewards for those who've been suffering, punishments for those who have vitality, how all of these come together for Scheler in this viewpoint. Now, is it completely fair to every understanding of altruism? Perhaps not. So I caution you, you have to think about any given author. What do they mean by their terms? Does what Scheler here call ressentiment map neatly onto altruism map neatly onto everybody's understanding of what altruism is? Perhaps not. But it does certainly look similar to what we often do see in modern life, does it not? Including from many people who claim to be Christians.